First, to try to offer some of my own thoughts about big issues which I haven't discussed in earlier books, and about which I hope that I might have something new to bring to the party, to complete my personal cycle about the Second World War, if you like. To give a few examples, it seems a remarkable paradox that while the German army fought most of its battles brilliantly well, much better than the Allies, its efforts were entirely set at naught by the stunning incompetence with which Germany's leadership conducted the war, fortunately for our side. Meanwhile, whatever the limitations of the US and British armies, their navies and air forces became terrific, and their war machines were superbly organized, especially in mobilizing the best civilian brains, an achievement exemplified by the ultra and magic decryptors in a fashion that the Axis never matched. For years, the turning point of the war was seen as coming at the end of 1942, with German defeat at Stalingrad. But it seems a critical historical reality that as early as December 1941, even before Pearl Harbor, senior functionaries of the Third Reich realized and even dared to tell Hitler that failure to defeat Russia before the winter meant that military victory in the conflict had become unattainable. Counterfactuals, might-have-beens, must always be treated with caution, but some can be fascinating. For instance, I suggest that Hitler might have done far more towards persuading the British people to surrender in 1940 by not sending the Luftwaffe to bomb them than by doing so. Before the war, many people feared an annihilatory air attack which would destroy British society. The unfulfilled threat of such an assault might have done much more to intimidate the public than the reality, which turned out to be nowhere near as bad as everybody had feared. If the British people had simply been left to stew while Hitler drove their army out of the Middle East, as he easily could have done, Churchill might have found it very hard to retain the premiership. The old Tory appeasers could have gained traction for a peace negotiation. On the American side, I'm inclined to think that the American Pacific War effort might have profited mightily in 1944-45 if General MacArthur could have been written out of script, and if the great Nimitz had been left to conduct a single thrust westward by the US Navy and Marine Corps. My other, and I believe more important purpose in this book, is to address the question so often asked by people of our generations which have been fortunate enough not to be there, Pa or Grandpa, what was the war like? The answer, of course, is that it was vastly different in kind for people in different circumstances. American tank crews and Chinese comfort women, British paratroopers and Leningrad housewives, German panzer officers and Polish Jews, all of whose predicaments I explore. I've tried to create not so much a history as a global portrait from the bottom up, a story of little people rather than warlords. You'll find no photographs in my text of generals or dictators, only of men, women, and children of embattled societies. They afterwards struggled to find words to describe what happened to them, transcending anything in their past lives. Many resorted to a cliché: all hell broke loose. Because the phrase is so common in eyewitness descriptions of battles, air raids, massacres, ship sinkings, later generations attempted to shrug at its banality. But the words seem to me vividly to capture what the struggle meant to hundreds of millions of people plucked from their ordered existences to face ordeals that in many cases lasted for years. Each day of the conflict, an average of 27,000 human beings perished around the world by violence, starvation, or war-induced disease. We sometimes read memoirs written by, or books about, heroes who make the whole experience sound a great romantic adventure. For instance, Cecil King on the US carrier Hornet later recalled, "I just felt at home at sea. I felt that's what the Navy's all about. Many times I would wander around the ship, particularly in the late afternoon, just enjoying being there. I feel like I'm probably one of the luckiest people in the entire world, for having been born in the year that I was to be able to fight for my country in World War II. This whole era that I've lived through is something I feel real privilege for having gone through. Likewise, Lieutenant Robert Hitchens of the Royal Navy wrote in his diary in July 1940, "I suppose our position is about as dangerous as is possible in view of the threatened invasion. But I couldn't help being full of joy. Being on the bridge of one of His Majesty's ships, being talked to by the captain as an equal, and knowing that she was to be in my sole care for the next few hours, who would not rather die like that than live as so many poor people have to, in crowded cities at some sweating indoor job?" Hitchens was killed in action in 1942, but he was a happy warrior. It's easy to understand why such a dashing young naval officer, or Winston Churchill, George Patton, the pilots who flew Mustangs and Spitfires, some German Panzer officers, had the time of their lives in World War II. For a vastly larger number of people, however, for hundreds of millions around the world who never had the opportunity or inclination to be heroes, the conflict required acceptance of miseries, hardships, sacrifices, matched by a sense of personal impotence, which made the experience wretched. Consider, for instance, a pathetic letter home written by William Crawford, a 17-year-old boy second class, serving aboard the battlecruiser Hood. "Dearest Mum, I know it's wrong to say, but I sure am fed up. I feel kind of sick. I cannot eat and my heart's in my mouth. We've struck bad weather today. Talk about waves as big as houses. They're crashing over our bows. I wonder if it would do any good, Mum, if you wrote to the Admiralty and asked them if there was no chance of me getting a shore job at Rosyth. You know, tell them you've got 2 sons away and that. Be sure to tell them my age. If only I could get off this ship, it would not be so bad." Crawford, however, was still aboard Hood when she was sunk with almost all hands in May 1941. He was just one of 60 million people of all ages and both sexes for whom the conflict became a personal tragedy. Ernie Pyle recorded the aspirations of soldiers whom he met before the invasion of Sicily, overwhelmingly dominated by the craving to go home. These gravely yearned for futures of men going into battle include so many things. Things such as seeing the old lady again, going to college, holding on your knee just once your own kid, again becoming champion salesman of your territory, driving a coal truck around the streets of Kansas City, and yes, just sitting in the sun once more on the south side of a house in New Mexico. It was these little hopes that made up the sum total of our worry, rather than any visualization of physical agony to come. Men's obsessive ambition to return to where they belonged became more emphatic when physical agony indeed came. A US Army nurse named Dorothy Beavers wrote a letter for what she called a beautiful young man, a captain, who had lost both arms and legs. Yet he still seemed thrilled that he could say, "I'm going home." When machine gunner Donald Shoe's driver had a hand blown off in the Ardennes, the man ran in circles, yelling hysterically, "I'm going home. Thank you, God, I'm going home." A US officer wrote from the Pacific, "When the tents are down, I think every man feels a loneliness because he sees that this wasn't home after all. As long as there were 4 canvas walls about him, he could kid himself a little. Standing on barren ground, surrounded by scrap lumber piles and barrack bags, with nothing familiar on his horizon, he feels uprooted and insecure, a wanderer on the face of the earth. That which is always in the back of his mind now stands starkly in the front. Will it ever end, and will I be here to see it?" Then there were the long periods of excruciating boredom. Staff Sergeant Harold Fennemer wrote to his wife Jeanette in Wisconsin, "So much of this war and army life amounts to the insignificant job of passing time, and that really is a pity. Life is so short and time so precious to those who live and love life that I can hardly believe myself seeking entertainment to pass time away." Isolation was a tiring sensation, even for men serving amid legions of their compatriots. John Steinbeck wrote from the British capital in 1943 about the GIs on its streets. I see all these thousands of lonely soldiers here. There's a kind of walk they have in London, an apathetic shuffle. They're looking for something. They'll say it's a girl, any girl, but it isn't that at all. Although soldiers talk incessantly about women, under the stress and unyielding discomfort of a battlefield, most crave simple pleasures, among which sex scarcely features. A US Marine Corps colonel in the South Pacific fantasized about his ambitions on returning home. I'm going to start wearing pajamas again. I'm going to polish off a few eggs and several quarts of milk. A few hot baths are also in order. But I'm saving the best for last. I'm going to spend a whole day flushing a toilet just to hear the water run. When I first explored the war in Bomber Command, published in 1979, I would never have guessed that the period would retain its grip on popular imagination around the world into this 21st century. There seem three reasons. This was the greatest event in human experience. Most people perceive it as that rare thing, a conflict in which good was pitted against indisputable evil. And finally, there seems inexhaustible scope for finding new things to say about it. Even after countless books, films, and TV documentaries, it's amazing how easy it is to surprise people with facts known to historians but little recognized by a wider public. I mentioned recently to a former head of the British Army that I'd written a new study of the war, and he responded skeptically. He said, "What on earth can you tell us that we don't know?" I asked him to guess what proportion of Germany's military dead were killed by the Russians. He suggested 60%. I told him the true figure is over 90%. The invasion of Russia was the defining event of World War II. After Germany's 1940 triumphs over Britain and France, it never occurred to Hitler that it might be more difficult to overcome a brutalized society inured to suffering than democracies in which moderation and respect for human life were deemed virtues. I next asked my military friend what percentage of total Allied casualties he's supposed to have been American or British, and he said maybe 20% each. Well, the real figure was just 2% American, a further 2% British. The Russians suffered 65%, Chinese 23%, Yugoslavs 3%. At least 15 million Chinese perished. Mere numbers are, of course, only part of the story, but they help to emphasize how far many people still have to travel to gain a global perspective about what happened to mankind between 1939 and 45. Some modern societies are stunningly ignorant or willfully misinformed. A few years ago, a Japanese writer named Kazutoshi Hando, who himself survived the Tokyo firestorm, lectured to a women's college. He told me, "I asked 50 students to list countries which have not fought Japan in modern times. 11 included America." Because the Soviet Union ended up in the Allied camp, not only most modern Russians, but also many Westerners are unaware that between 1939 and June 1941, Stalin was seen around the world as Hitler's partner in tyranny and aggression, the rapist of Finland, East Poland, Eastern Romania. At least 350,000 Poles died as victims of Russian rather than Nazi oppression and imprisonment. In my view, only the single enormity of the Holocaust justifies judging Hitler a more dreadful and murderous tyrant than Stalin. Yet Russia was supposedly joined with Britain and America in a crusade for freedom. Confusing, isn't it? Many Westerners' view of the war remains dominated by nationalistic perspectives, cherished myths and legends. Everybody knows about the gallant fighters of the French resistance, supported by British agents of SOE, American agents of OSS. Rather, fewer people appreciate just how fiercely French troops fought against the British in Syria in 1941, as they did also in Madagascar, and briefly against American troops in North Africa the following year. A French soldier scrawled a graffiti on the wall of a fort in Syria before his unit abandoned it. "Wait, dirty English bastards, until the Germans come. We run away now, but so will you soon." It's easy to forget that in many nations, many people rooted for the Axis, often because they hated the British Empire. Winston Churchill stretched a delicate point by telling the House of Commons on 8th of December 1941, "We have at least 4/5 of the population of the globe on our side." It would have been more accurate to say that the Allies had 4/5 of the world's inhabitants under their control or recoiling from Axis occupation. Propaganda promoted an assumption of common purpose among free nations, of which it was necessary to grant honorary membership to Stalin's tyranny in defeating the totalitarian powers. Yet in almost every country there were nuances of attitude or stark divisions. The mercenaries of Britain's Indian Army remained generally loyal, and some Indian civilians cherished a deep affection for Britain. I'm moved by the story of one named P.G. Mahindasa, who was teacher of the English school in Malacca settlement. He wrote, after torture and before execution by the occupying Japanese for listening on his radio to the BBC, "I have always cherished British sportsmanship, justice, and the civil service as the finest things in an imperfect world. I die gladly for freedom. My enemies fail to conquer my soul. I forgive them for what they did to my frail body. To my dear boys, tell them that their teacher died with a smile on his lips." But many of India's 400 million people saw scant advantage in Allied victory if they remained subject to British rule. For most of the war, the imperial power was obliged to use more troops to maintain its internal control of India amid militant nationalism than were deployed against the Japanese. Nehru, later the first and greatest Prime Minister of an independent India, wrote from his British prison cell the day after Pearl Harbor, "If I was asked with whom my sympathies lay in this war, I would unhesitatingly say with Russia, China, America, and England. But for the Congress President, there remained an insuperable obstacle to giving his active support to the Allies. Churchill refused to grant India independence, and thus Nehru wrote, 'There is no question of my giving help to Britain. How can I fight for a thing, freedom, which is denied to me? British policy in India appears to be to terrify the people, so that in anxiety we may seek British protection.' Meanwhile, in Egypt, Britain exploited to the limits and beyond its treaty rights with a supposedly sovereign state. The country was governed as if it was a colony. Most Egyptians strongly supported the Axis, believing that its victory would free them from imperial subjection. During riots in 1942, crowds thronged Cairo streets, shouting enthusiastically, 'Rommel, Rommel!' Anwar Sadat, an army officer who later became Egypt's president, spent much of the war in a British jail for aiding German spies. He wrote later, 'Our enemy was primarily, if not solely, Great Britain.' None of this should suggest that I doubt the virtue of the Allied cause. Rather, I simply want to show that at the time, Churchill and Roosevelt did not have all the best tunes. It does us no harm in justly congratulating our parents and grandparents on what they did, to be reminded of some blemishes on the Allied escutcheon, foremost among them the 1943 Bengal famine. At least 1 million people, perhaps as many as 3 million, perished under British rule. Thousands died on the streets of Calcutta, while in the city's clubs, white sahibs enjoyed unlimited eggs and bacon. The famine originated in Japanese seizure of neighboring Burma. from which much of Bengal's rice supply traditionally came, and it was worsened by crop failure and a cyclone. To the dismay of India's Viceroy, General Wavell, Churchill refused to divert shipping to transport food to relieve the needy. The Prime Minister cited the urgent strategic demands of the war, which were real enough. But Wavell wrote bitterly later, when hundreds of bombers were used to feed Holland, a very different attitude exists towards feeding a starving population when the starvation is in Europe. More than any other aspect of the war, food, or lack of it, emphasized the relativity of suffering. Globally, far more people suffered serious hunger, or indeed died of starvation, than in any previous conflict in history, including World War I, because an unprecedented range of countries became battlefields. Even those countries which escaped famine found their diets severely restricted. Britain's rationing system ensured that nobody starved and the poor were better nourished than in peacetime, but few found anything to enjoy about their fare. A land girl named Joan Ibbotson wrote, "Food was our obsession. We had dried egg once a week for breakfast, but the good lady in charge liked to cook it overnight, so it resembled and tasted like sawdust on toast." Most British households improvised to supplement authorised rations. Derek Lambert, then a small boy, recorded a domestic scene. "One morning a jar was put on the breakfast table with supreme nonchalance. My father, an undemonstrative man, spread the nectar on his bread and bit into it. He frowned and said, 'What was that?' 'Carrot marmalade,' said my mother. With unusual deliberation, he picked up the jar, took it into the garden, and poured it onto the compost heap." Yet any Russian or Asian peasant or Axis captive would have thought carrot marmalade a luxury. Kenneth Stevens was a prisoner of the Japanese in Singapore's Changi jail. He wrote, "In this place, one's mind returns continually and dwells longingly on food. I think of duck and cherry casserole, scrambled eggs, fish scallops, chicken Stanley, kedgeree, trifle, summer pudding, fruit fool, bread and butter pudding. All those lovely things were made just perfectly right in my own home." Stevens died of hunger in August 1943 without ever again tasting such delicacies. French girl children shrank by an average of 11 centimetres and boys by 7 centimetres between 1935 and 44. Tuberculosis, stimulated by malnutrition, increased dramatically in occupied Europe, and by 1943, 4/5 of Belgian children were displaying symptoms of rickets. In the matter of diet, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand escaped lightly, and Americans scarcely suffered at all. Rationing was introduced to Roosevelt's people only in 1943, and then on a generous scale. Meat was almost the only commodity in short supply. A housewife named Catherine Renee Young wrote to her husband in May 1943, "I'm sick of the same thing. We hardly ever see good steak anymore, and steak is the main meat that gives us strength. My dad just came back from the store, and all he could get was blood pudding, and how I hate that." Every nation with power to do so put its own people first, heedless of the consequences for others at their mercy. The Axis, not surprisingly, behaved most brutally with the direst consequences. Nazi policy in the East was explicitly directed towards starving subject races in order to feed Germans. People in occupied regions displayed extraordinary ingenuity in hiding crops, and they clung tenaciously to life in defiance of the predictions of Nazi nutritionists who'd been optimistic enough to anticipate 30 to 40 million fatalities. But in pursuit of the Wehrmacht's policy of living off the land, German soldiers in the East consumed an estimated 7 million tons of Russian grain, 17 million cattle, 20 million pigs, 27 million sheep and goats, over 100 million domestic fowls, and millions of their lawful owners starved to death in consequence. The Japanese, throughout their empire, adopted draconian policies to provide food for their own people, which caused mass starvation in Southeast Asia, with 1 million victims in Vietnam alone. China also suffered appallingly, its peasants despoiled by both the Japanese and nationalist armies. In Henan province in 1942, when unseasonable frost and hail were followed by a plague of locusts, millions had to leave their land and many perished. Peasants ate elm bark and dried leaves. Meanwhile, in Leningrad, in the course of almost 3 years under siege, 800,000 people perished, and some survived only by eating each other. In the first 10 days of January 1942, the secret police, the NKVD, reported 42 cases of cannibalism. Corpses were found with thighs and breasts hacked off. Worse, the weak became vulnerable to murder, not for their meaningless property, but for their flesh. On the 4th of February, a man visiting a militia office reported seeing 12 women arrested for cannibalism, which they did not deny. He wrote, "One woman, utterly worn out and desperate, said that when her husband fainted through exhaustion and lack of food, she hacked off part of his leg to feed herself and her children." The prisoners sobbed, knowing that they faced execution. That February, by far the worst month of the siege, 20,000 people were reported to be dying every day. Amid a weakened population, dysentery became a killer. There were queues at street taps for water, and fires burned unchecked for lack of hands to extinguish them. Supplies of coffins ran out. Many of those with energy to read turned to War and Peace, the only book that seemed capable of explaining their agony. In the West, American and British infantrymen were appalled by their experiences in the 11 months of the 1944-45 Northwest Europe campaign. But Russians and Germans fought each other continuously for almost 4 years in far worse conditions and with vastly heavier casualties. Between 1941 and 44, American and British sailors and airmen engaged the Axis at sea and in the sky, but relatively small numbers of Western Allied ground troops took part in the little campaigns in North Africa, Italy, Asia, and the Pacific. In July 1943, for instance, when almost 4 million Axis and Soviet troops were locked in bloody combat at Kursk and Orel, where 500,000 Russians died, a mere 8 Anglo-American divisions were fighting in Sicily, scene of the principal Western effort against the Nazis, where they suffered just 6,000 dead. Many people who endured the war, soldiers and civilians alike, witnessed spectacles comparable with Renaissance painters' conception of the Inferno to which the damned were consigned. Human beings torn to fragments of flesh and bone, cities blasted into rubble, ordered communities sundered into dispersed human particles. Almost everything which civilized folk take for granted in time of peace was swept aside, above all the expectation of being protected from violence. I've tried to illuminate the complex significance for a host of ordinary people, both active and passive participants, though the distinction is often blurred. Was a Hamburg woman who ardently supported Hitler but died in the July 1943 firestorm generated by Allied bombing, an accomplice to Nazi war guilt, or the innocent victim of an atrocity. So widespread is a modern Western perception that the war was fought about Jews that it deserves to be emphasized that this was not the case. Though Hitler and his followers chose to blame the Jews for the troubles of Europe and grievances of the Third Reich, Germany's struggle with the Allies was about power and hemispheric dominance. The plight of the Jewish people under Nazi occupation loomed relatively small in the wartime perceptions of Churchill and Roosevelt, and less surprisingly in that of Stalin. about 1/7 of all fatal victims of Nazism and almost 1/10 of all wartime dead ultimately proved to have been Jews. But at the time, their persecution was viewed by the Allies merely as one fragment of the collateral damage of Hitler, as indeed Russians still see the Holocaust today. It seems to me important to assess it not in isolation, as it usually is, but against the background of Hitler's governance of his entire empire, which included, for instance, starving to death more than 3 million Russian prisoners in German hands. One of the most moving and enlightened advocates of pursuing such context was a young Jewish girl named Ruth Meyer. As a 22-year-old refugee in Oslo, barely a month before her own deportation and murder in Auschwitz, she wrote in her diary, "If you shut yourself away and look at this persecution and torture of Jews only from the viewpoint of a Jew, then you will develop some sort of complex which is bound to lead to a slow but certain psychological collapse. The only solution is to see the Jewish question from a broader perspective, within the framework of the oppressed Czechs and Norwegians, the oppressed workers. We'll only be rich when we understand that it's not just we who are a race of martyrs, that beside us there are countless others suffering who will suffer like us until the end of time if we don't fight for a better." She broke off to express exasperation about the persistence of her own instinct to see the Jewish tragedy as unique. But her mental confusion does not diminish the nobility and unselfishness of this very young woman's words from the threshold of the grave. One of the most important truths about the war, as indeed about all human affairs, is that people can interpret what happens to them only in the context of their own circumstances. The fact that objectively and statistically the sufferings of some individuals were less terrible than those of others elsewhere in the world was meaningless to those concerned. It would have seemed monstrous to a GI facing a mortar barrage with his comrades dying around him to be told that Russian casualties were many times greater. It would have been insulting to invite a hungry Frenchman or even an English housewife, weary of the monotony of rations, simply to thank their stars that they weren't starving to death in millions like the Russians or West Bengalis who were selling their daughters. The fact that the plight of other people was worse than one's own did little to promote personal stoicism. Some aspect of wartime experience were almost universal: fear and grief, the conscription of young men and women obliged to endure new existences utterly remote from those of their choice, often under arms and at worst as slaves. A boom in prostitution was a tragic global phenomenon. The conflict provoked many mass migrations. Some of these were orderly. Half the population of Britain moved home in the course of the war. Many Americans took new jobs in unfamiliar places. Elsewhere, however, millions were wrenched from their communities in dreadful circumstances and faced ordeals which often killed them. An anonymous Berlin woman wrote in April 1945 in one of the great diaries of the war, "These are strange times. History experienced firsthand, the stuff of tales yet untold and songs unsung. But seen close up, history is much more troublesome, nothing but burdens and fears. Tomorrow I'll go and look for nettles and get some coal." News of the violent and premature deaths of distant loved ones was a pervasive feature of wartime experience. Often little was known of their fate. As an Englishman named J.R. Ackley noted in a 1942 poem, "We never knew what became of him, that was so curious. He embarked, it was in December, and never returned. No chance to say goodbye, and Christmas confronting us. A few letters arrived long after and came to an end. The weeks dragged into months, and then it was December again. We troubled the officials, of course, and they cabled about. They were patient but busy, importunities without number. Some told us one thing, some another. They never found out. There's a lot go like that, without explanation. And death is death after all. Small comfort to know how and when. But I keep thinking, now that we've dropped the investigation, it was more like the death of an insect than of a man. American Deli Hahn was one of many women who married the wrong man amid the stress and emotional extravagance of the time and repented at leisure during the years that followed. He was a soldier. He could not be anything but a marvelous, magnificent human being, she said, with the ruefulness of one who learnt better. She came to pity others who experienced domestic miseries. Pregnant women who could barely balance in a rocking train, going to see their husbands for the last time before the guys were sent overseas. Women coming back from seeing their husbands traveling with small children, trying to feed their kids, diaper their kids. I felt sorriest for them. It suddenly occurred to me that this wasn't half as much fun as I'd been told it was going to be. Many children clung to parting memories of fathers from whom they became separated for years and in some cases forever. A little Californian named Bernice Schmidt was 9 when her parents got divorced. As a newly single man, her 32-year-old father, Arthur, thus became eligible to be drafted. He was given leave from training camp before embarkation and took his 3 children to a Los Angeles amusement park. He told them how homesick he was and gave each a little parting present. Bernice's was a pin in the shape of 2 hearts held together with an arrow inscribed, "Bernice loved Daddy." PFC Schmidt was killed in action with the 317th Infantry on the 15th of November 1944. His daughter never forgot the day that news came because it was her 12th birthday. The nature of battlefield experience varied from nation to nation, service to service. Within armies, riflemen experienced far higher levels of risk and hardship than millions of support troops. The US Armed Forces suffered an overall death rate of just 5 per 1,000 men enlisted. The vast majority of those who served faced perils no greater than those of ordinary civilian life. While 17,000 American combat casualties lost limbs, during the war years, 100,000 workers at home became amputees because of industrial accidents. Nobody fighting the war, except national leaders and commanders, knew much about anything beyond their immediate line of sight. Civilians existed in a fog of propaganda and uncertainty, scarcely less dense in the United States and Britain than in Germany or Russia. Frontline combatants assess the success or failure of their side chiefly through counting casualties and noticing whether they were moving forwards or backwards. These were, however, sometimes inadequate indicators. For instance, PFC Eric Diller's battalion was cut off from the main American army for 17 days during the Leyte campaign in the Philippines. But he realized the seriousness of his unit's predicament only when this was explained to him by his company commander after the war had ended. Even those with privileged access to secrets were confined to their own fragments of knowledge in a vast jigsaw puzzle. My old friend Roy Jenkins, later a British statesman, decrypted German signals at Bletchley Park. He and his colleagues knew the importance and urgency of the work they were doing, but contrary to the impression given in sensational movies about Bletchley, they were told nothing about the significance or impact of their contributions. Such constraints were greater, unsurprisingly, on the other side of the hill. In January 1942, Hitler decided that too many Germans knew too much. He decreed that even officials of the Abwehr should receive only such information as was necessary for their own work. They were forbidden even to monitor enemy broadcasts, which was quite a handicap for an intelligence service. Under fire, the hell of bombardment, most people focused upon immediacies and loyalties towards each other. Their hopes and fears became elemental, as described by British Lieutenant Norman Craig in The Desert. Life was so free of all its complexities. What a clarity and simplicity it really had. To stay alive, to lead once more a normal existence, to know again warmth, comfort, and safety, what else could one conceivably demand? I would never chide circumstance again, never question fate, never feel bored, unhappy, or dissatisfied. To be allowed to continue to live, nothing else mattered. The chances of achieving this simple purpose varied immensely from country to country and service to service. About 8% of all Germans died, compared with 14% of Soviet citizens, 2% of Chinese, 3.4% of Dutch people, almost 7% of Yugoslavs, 4% of Greeks, 1.35% of French people, 3.78% of Japanese, 0.94% of British people, 0.32% of Americans. Within the armed forces, 31% of Germans conscripted into the Wehrmacht died, 35% of the Waffen-SS. Some 24% of Japanese conscripted were killed. 1 Russian soldier in 4 died, against 1 in 20 British Commonwealth combatants, 1 in 34 American servicemen. When the Western Allies celebrated victory in Europe in May 1945, tens of millions of people under Stalin's new tyranny continued to suffer appallingly. For instance, for 2 years after V-Day, the NKVD waged a ruthless counterinsurgency campaign in Poland and the Ukraine to impose Stalin's will upon peoples consumed with bitterness about exchanging Nazi tyranny for that of the Soviets. Exiled Poles in the West were deeply dismayed to be denied a place in London's victory parade because the new British Labour government declined to upset the Russians. General Władysław Anders of the Polish army wrote, "I felt as if I were peeping at a ballroom from behind the curtain of an entrance door through which I might not pass." His bitterness was justified. He and almost 150,000 of his compatriots had fought gallantly with the Allied forces, taking heavy casualties in Italy and Northwest Europe. A Polish pilot named Lvov wrote, "We, the Poles in uniform integrated into the British Armed Forces, became an ugly sore on the English conscience." In 1945, he and his comrades suddenly found themselves pariahs for the sole crime of rejecting a Stalinist puppet regime in their own country, for whose freedom Britain and France had gone to war in September 1939. The Poles ended the conflict as they'd begun it, human sacrifices to the realities of power. Anders, Lvov, and many of their comrades chose exile in the West rather than return home to Soviet subjection, probable execution. The Americans and British had delivered half Europe from one totalitarian tyranny, but they lacked the political will and military means to save 90 million people in the East from falling victim to a new Soviet bondage that lasted almost half a century. The price the Western Allies paid for having joined with Stalin to destroy Hitler was high indeed. Some modern historians who are citizens of nations that were once European colonies today regard their peoples as victims of wartime exploitation. They suggest that Britain, especially, engaged them in a struggle in which they had no stake for a cause which was not properly theirs. Such arguments represent points of view rather than evidential conclusions, but it seems important for Westerners to recognize such sentiments as a counterpoint to our own instinctive assumption that our grandparents fought the good war. The United States was the only belligerent which emerged from the conflict without a sense of victimhood. Most of its people took pride both in their contribution to Allied victory and in their new status as the richest and most powerful nation on earth. It was characteristic of American romanticism that a war which the United States joined because it was attacked by Japan evolved during the ensuing 45 months into a crusade for freedom. Thanks to Pearl Harbor, fewer of Roosevelt's people questioned the justice of their cause than in any other war which the country has fought. PFC Robert Leckershman wrote, "It was the last time most Americans thought they were innocent and good without qualification." Intellectuals reflected on the vast experience the world had undergone Arthur Schlesinger wrote grudgingly, "It was, I suppose, a good war, but like all wars, ours was accompanied by atrocity and sadism, stupidity and lies, pomposity and chicken shit. War remains hell, but a few wars have been driven by decent purposes and produced beneficial results." Schlesinger's fellow historian, Forrest Pogue, who had crossed northwest Europe with the US Army, wrote, "The war, while giving me a chance to see more of the world and of all kinds of people, nevertheless confused me. I lived more thoroughly an ordinary life than ever before. I found how much man lives next to the animal. It made me tougher-minded and more tolerant and sympathetic of human frailty, but also sufficiently confused so that I've not yet been able to discover any answers." Within Western culture today, the conflict continues to exercise a fascination for generations unborn when it took place. One obvious explanation is that within the vast compass of the struggle, some individuals scaled summits of courage and nobility, while others plumbed depths of evil in a fashion that compels the awe of posterity. Among citizens of modern democracies, to whom serious hardship and collective peril are unknown, the tribulations that hundreds of millions endured between 1939 and 45 are almost beyond comprehension. Almost everybody who participated, nations and individuals alike, made moral compromises. It's impossible to dignify the struggle as an unalloyed contest between good and evil, nor rationally to celebrate an experience which brought such misery to so many people. Allied victory did not bring universal peace, prosperity, justice, or freedom. It brought merely a portion of those things to some fraction of those who had taken part. All that seems certain is that Allied victory saved the world from a much, much worse fate that would have followed a triumph of Germany and Japan. With this knowledge, seekers after virtue and truth must be content. Thank you very much.